On behalf of the Observer Research Foundation America, good afternoon and a warm welcome to the Raisina Dialogue DC. My name is Sharon Sterling. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at ORF America. This is a very exciting day for our team because this is actually the first event to be held in our new office in Washington, D.C. ORF America was established in late 2020 during the height of the coronavirus pandemic. But over the past 16 months, we've hit the ground running. Our Cyberspace Cooperation Initiative has been holding a series of virtual roundtables as part of the global cyber policy dialogues, convening stakeholders in regional formats focused on Latin America, the Western Balkans, Southern Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. Over the next year and a half, they will follow up on these virtual meetings with in-person roundtables in North Macedonia, South Africa, Chile, Jordan, and Singapore. We've also convened discussions on other pressing issues related to emerging technology policy, including artificial intelligence cooperation among the Quad countries and the implications of U.S. cyber strategy in Southeast Asia. Our economic policy colleagues, in cooperation with ORF in India, have been focused on the issue of making supply chains more resilient, hosting conversations with the private sectors in India and the United States. We've also convened roundtables on democratic cooperation to coincide with the Biden administration's Summit for Democracy. And we've co-organized a strategic dialogue on global issues with participants from India, Europe, and the United States. Finally, ORF America was the executing partner on a leadership development program focused on young entrepreneurs from the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. In cooperation with the U.S. State Department, Astrolabs, and the PepsiCo Foundation, we brought a cohort of 40 young leaders from 19 countries to the World's Fair in Dubai as part of an intense 8-month-long program. These are just a snapshot of some of our activities over the past year, and we are excited to be doing much more over the coming months and years. Let me turn it over to Dhruva Jaishankar, who's the Executive Director for ORF America, who will moderate today's opening panel for his own welcome remarks.
Thank you, Sharon. Before we start our first panel, it really is a special moment for me, personally, to be welcoming you all to ORF America, because this is what you see today is in some ways the culmination of over 3 years of work. There are, by one count, almost 400 think tanks in Washington, D.C., but still a relatively rare occasion to be introducing a new public policy institution. In fact, I'm joined on this stage by two people who have founded relatively new think tanks, very successful ones, I might add, who know a thing or two about the trials and tribulations involved. ORF America is, as its name suggests, an American institution, but equally, it is defined by its partnership with ORF, one of India's leading institutes, with the mission of addressing policy challenges facing the United States, India, and their partners amid significant global upheaval. But it's precisely the changes that we are witnessing around the world today, geopolitical and technological challenges, economic and environmental challenges, that define our agenda and sense of purpose. In some sense, when people ask why ORF America, the reasons seem rather obvious. The US-India partnership will be a defining one for the foreseeable future. Not always without its differences and difficulties, but also with a great deal of convergence and cooperation. And that relationship between two of the world's 3 largest populations, 2 of the world's 3 largest militaries, soon 2 of the world's 3 largest economies, both of them democracies, one developed and one developing, will naturally have global implications. Generating a better understanding of each other's policies is imperative. And this long-term investment, this ideas bridge between India and the United States on global issues, is in part what ORF America is all about. A sample of some of our future efforts illustrates this. We hope to have standing dialogues between India and the United States with partners in 3 critical geopolitical theaters: the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. In addition to our ongoing work on cybersecurity, we hope to add a research stream on 5G and semiconductor partnerships. We hope to contribute to cooperation on development assistance and supply chain resilience. And we hope to elevate cooperation and increase understanding between India and the United States on climate and energy policy. Our growing staff of 10 offer expertise in these areas and reflect diverse perspectives. Much of this would not be possible without our broad-based partnership with ORF. As we speak, ORF is hosting the Raisina Dialogue in New Delhi, featuring participants from over 90 countries, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who is this year's keynote. Foreign ministers of 14 countries are attending, and from the United States, we have Indo-PACOM Commander Admiral Aquilino, Assistant Secretary of Defense Eli Ratner, and Deputy National Security Advisor Anne Neuberger, all featuring. This occasion offers the perfect opportunity for those of us unable, or in some cases hesitant, to make the long schlep out to New Delhi to meet here for the Raisina Dialogue DC. Our agenda at today's event reflects ORF America's priorities and our values of nonpartisanship, diversity, and international cooperation. How can the United States retain a leadership role in the Indo-Pacific, a vast region of both unparalleled opportunity, but also arguably the greatest geopolitical challenge the United States has faced in decades? What can the United States do to partner with the developing world on energy transitions, to ensure supply, manage costs, and achieve climate objectives? How is the United States contending with threats in cyberspace, and what will that mean for others? While we have several officials from the US government joining us to discuss these issues, we will also feature perspectives from Malaysia and Australia, experts on Africa and India, in the spirit of bringing Washington to the world and the world to Washington. With that, welcome once again to what is the first in-person Raisina Dialogue DC and our inaugural panel on the US role in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Good job.
I'll put on my moderator's hat now and introduce what is a great panel. Just 5 years ago, in this town, the term Indo-Pacific would have elicited more questions than answers and a great deal of cynicism. Today, it's been defined by two US presidencies of two different parties, as well as the US military, as a critical theater of engagement. We have an excellent group here to discuss US policy to the region, and I'll introduce them shortly. I'm going to start, however, with Senator Bill Hagerty, who represents Tennessee in the US Senate and serves, among other roles, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was previously US Ambassador to Japan and had an extensive career in the public service and the private sector. Senator Hagerty might have to leave us a little early because of votes in the Senate, so I thought I would start off by asking him before turning to the rest of the panel. Senator Hagerty, do you think you could give us a view from the Senate on the United States evolving policy towards the Indo-Pacific? You have an extensive diplomatic career and private sector experience. How do you see the growing role of the Indo-Pacific from the Senate?
Well, I think the Indo-Pacific is the most important region of the world for us to be focused on right now. I've had a great deal of concern, given all of the issues that are arising around the world, that we not take our eye off the ball in that region. In fact, I just got back from leading a congressional delegation to Japan to again reemphasize, alongside Senators Cardin and Senators Corden, that this remains a critical aspect of the world. You mentioned the importance of the evolving U.S.-India relationship. And I believe that if we get this right, that the United States-India strategic partnership will be far more consequential for the 21st century in this world than China ever will. I also want to say this. One of my good friends, Matt Pottinger, used to describe the region broadly as reaching from California to Kilimanjaro. And I certainly know my Indian friend's perspective is that we need to take into account what's happening from the east coast of Africa all the way across the region. I couldn't agree more. This entire area holds great potential for us and also at the same time is under great threat from what I view as malign activity from countries like China. So we should be partnering and looking for opportunities at every place that we can. And I think one of the main messages that I've tried to convey in that region is that our economic partnership can be closely and deeply aligned with our national security. And I worked very hard to put in place a series of relationships when I served as United States Ambassador to Japan between what is now called the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. Japan's similar development entity is called JBIC, the similar one from Australia. And we'd like to continue to broaden this, but it's called the Blue Dot Network. And it's our effort to offer commercial, market-based financing terms that can be shown as an alternative to China's One Belt, One Road. I think we're all familiar enough with the debt trap diplomacy that China deploys. We saw this happen in Sri Lanka with the second deepwater port there. It's very concerning what's happening in a region very close to India. If you think about what's happening there, what's happening in Djibouti, and the influence that China is pushing well into Africa with an aim toward controlling countries that have very critical commodities that are going to be very valuable to the future. So I think we should continue to look for ways to find economic ties that will deepen our relationships throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Another thing I mentioned, I just returned from a CODEL to Japan. I met there with the current Prime Minister, with the former Prime Minister, with many cabinet members, large number of parliamentarians, and also with business leaders from very innovative companies, very strategic companies there in Japan. And almost to a person, they asked me for America to rethink our energy policy. And they had a valid reason for doing this, because when I served as U.S. Ambassador to Japan, I pushed very hard and encouraged the Japanese to put in place billions of dollars of infrastructure to import U.S. LNG. Not only to import it into Japan, but to serve as a transshipment point to broader parts of East Asia. And Japan did do this. Japan has begun to invest a great deal. Japan has been reliant on the United States to export LNG to it. In my view then, and remains so now, that LNG is going to be a critical transitional technology that we can use to help countries in the developing world to move from some very dirty energy components to something that's, in a stepwise basis, cleaner and more efficient. What I hate to see is a theology take hold that says we will only support those projects that leap all the way to alternative energy, skipping everything in the middle that has a large variety of economic benefits to the nations that would work with us, and also leaves the market open for China that doesn't have the same sort of interest that we do in the environment and the economics. So they implored me to help rethink that. I'm looking forward to getting back and working with the Biden administration here to try to think through ways that we can build a constructive energy policy. As we've seen the war unfold in Ukraine and the concerns about European dependency on Russian oil, the Japanese reminded me that they have been dependent on Russian energy too. And the time has come for us to step up our partnership there, not to be walking away from it. There's a great concern that there may be more LNG shipped to Europe right now to fill the gap, which would again leave Japan and other countries in that region in a more vulnerable situation. So I think we have to look not only at our economic policy, but at our energy policy as well. On the trade front, I worked very hard as U.S. Ambassador to Japan to execute a Japan-U.S. bilateral free trade agreement. And those of us that have been involved in free trade agreements know how hard that is. And I worked my heart out for 2 years to get that done. That trade agreement has embedded in it a very high standard digital trade agreement. And I know there are many calls for us to return to the TPP. I just think, you look at the politics around this, that could be a big challenge. But I do think that we have a well-negotiated component of the bilateral agreement that could be broadened. And I think many of our partners in that region, I could see, engage with us on a high standard digital trade agreement that could be a foundation for continuing to broaden our trade relationships on a more multilateral basis. So I see that as another area of great opportunity. But I would say this as well. Our partners in that region are understanding the precarious nature of the world right now. We've just seen Japan step up from a commitment of 1% of GDP committed to its national defense to 2% over the next 5 years. That is a major step forward, a major statement made by the current Prime Minister. They're also interpreting their constitution in a more, I would say, aggressive fashion. I was fortunate to live in the home that General MacArthur lived in for 6 years. They rebuilt the country, and they also redrafted the Constitution then to make it very pacifist. But I think Japan is willing now to interpret their constitutional limitations, which are oriented toward defense, as everything is defense-oriented right now. And even if that requires some sort of preemptive activity, that's putting them in a posture that's far more aligned with us. I think we need to continue to find ways to interact with Japan. When I was there with Japan, and again, I think most of our friends here know this, but the United States has more military deployed in Japan than any other place in the world. It's a very strategic position for us. And as they increase their defense expenditures, I encourage them not to make this a procurement exercise, but an exercise in speed, an exercise in interoperability with our own forces, and an exercise in competence, because that's what we need to see in the region. There is a tremendous effort from China right now, pushing in all directions in that region, and I think our cooperation will make a very, very big difference. I just had, in a Senate Foreign Relations Committee meeting about an hour ago, the opportunity to talk with Secretary Blinken. And in that conversation, I encouraged him to think hard about how we might work together in the Indo-Pacific area to help our partners there. And I think about Australia being in a position to export in the region, how we can work in a constructive manner with all of our partners to strengthen our economic, energy, and commercial ties to build that region in a way that follows market-based alternatives. And Secretary Blinken was very favorable in terms of looking at that, and I think we'll all be better off as we do. But I would just end my comments with this, a high note of optimism about the potential for the strategic relationship between the United States and India. And as the world's largest democracy and the world's largest economy work more closely together, even though, as you mentioned, we're going to have our differences in terms of how we may view things along the way, taking the long view, which is what I do, and again, my term of office is longer than the U.S. president, taking the long view, we have great potential, and I intend to work very hard to help us realize that potential so that we do strike a meaningful and positive mark for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may turn to Michèle Flournoy. Michèle Flournoy is co-founder and managing partner of WestExec Advisors. She was previously co-founder and now chair of the Center for New American Security, which is somewhat of a neighbor of ours, just down the street. And so, as I mentioned, knows a thing or two about starting a think tank. She previously served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Obama administration. You've been very engaged with the region for a while, thinking through the strategic landscape and U.S. security posture in the region. How do you see the relative importance of the Indo-Pacific from a U.S. policy standpoint?
Well, congratulations on establishing a new think tank from one founder to another. It's a hard thing to do, and I wish you all great success, and thank you all for being here. I really think when you look forward over the next 50 years, there's no region of the world that will be more important to U.S. economic prosperity and to U.S. security than the Indo-Pacific. I understand there's a war happening right now in the heart of Europe, which none of us thought we'd ever see at this point, but and that is very important to focus on and deal with decisively. However, I think in looking to the long term, I agree with the senator that we've got to keep our eye on the ball in the region. First and foremost, because of the tremendous opportunities we have there, the treaty allies we have there, the deep strategic partners we have there, and just the vital interests we have at stake. We have a great deal invested in maintaining a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And right now, we see a rising China that has sort of dropped the veil, if you will, and adopted a much more assertive, sometimes aggressive stance in the region, which often involves trying to unilaterally change the status quo, impose a kind of might makes right order. And I think we're now starting to see this in a larger frame of a competition between authoritarian states like China and Russia on the one hand and democracies, whether it's US, European, India, and others in the region. And so this competition is there's a lot at stake in terms of how it comes out. It's got ideological dimensions, as I mentioned, economic dimensions, technological dimensions, military dimensions. And I would just add, I think the senator covered the energy and economic piece very well. I would just add from a defense and technology perspective, we are also, as this sort of the tectonic shifts in the balance of power in the world are happening, we're also experiencing a period of profound technological disruption. So the things that may have given us confidence in having the most innovative, vibrant economy in the past or the best military in the world, if we just rest on our laurels, that will not be the case in the future. We have got to innovate, we've got to invest in a whole number of cutting-edge technologies that will define the future, whether it's AI, whether it's quantum computing, whether it's synthetic biology, the list goes on. The good news is we have tremendous advantage in our allies and our partners. We can compete better, we can develop these cutting-edge technologies and capabilities faster if we work on them together. And I think there's huge potential for a group like ORF to help define what are some of those particular opportunities where we as partners can go deeper and accelerate our innovation, accelerate the advancement in some of these key areas. And then on the defense side, I will say that I think the name of the game here will be deterrence. I think President Xi's been very clear about some of his ambitions for the region. Right now, he's facing a COVID crisis, and he's dealing with preparations for the 20th Party Congress at the end of the year. But beyond that, assuming he is, validated as kind of chairman of the party for the indefinite future, he's been very clear about his legacy and what he wants to accomplish, and his willingness to use coercive, if not military means, to achieve those ends. And so I think we have to focus not only on the long-term investments to stay competitive in all of these dimensions, but a very near and midterm problem of deterrence, where we've got to improve our cooperation with our allies and partners. We have to improve our posture. We have to develop some new concepts of approaching it, given that we have, a country with a very different strategic calculus than what we've typically thought about in the past. We have a very different set of geography with a very different set of circumstances, including years of Chinese investment in developing systems that will try to prevent us from being able to project power into the region or have influence in the region or defend our allies as our treaty commitments require and as our interests require. So we have a lot of work to do to bolster deterrence and try to prevent what is going to be a competition, a fierce competition, I think, from actually erupting into conflict. We all have a profound interest in preventing two nuclear powers going into a direct conflict with one another. And oh, by the way, we also have an imperative to think about, even in the context of this competition, how do we cooperate? Find avenues of cooperation with China on things like climate change, where if we don't cooperate, game over in terms of really achieving our goals of dramatically reducing emissions and creating a better future for our children and their children. So this is a very challenging agenda with lots of really tough problems, but also great opportunity and a huge advantage that we have in the deep alliance and partnership relationships we have. So I think there's lots of good work for us to do together to try to come up with some good solutions here.
Wonderful. We're also really pleased to have Dr. Mira Rapp-Hooper with us today. She's the Director for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the White House National Security Council staff, previously worked in policy planning at the U.S. State Department, and prior to that affiliated with Yale University and the Center for New American Security. Mira, thanks so much for joining us. I know it's a really busy time for you. You played a key role in the development of the Indo-Pacific strategy that the U.S. government, that the White House put out recently. For people who are unfamiliar with it, could you give what you'd say are some of the key highlights of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy?
Absolutely, Dhruva. And I'll start by saying congratulations to you. Congratulations to Sharon on the great work that you all are doing here. And it's really a delight to join this terrific panel today. I'll start by noting that the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy was rolled out on February 11th of this year, just about 10 days before Russia launched its further invasion of Ukraine. It was rolled out by the Secretary of State on his trip to the region on the island of Fiji, with all of us in the U.S. government deeply aware of what was about to unfold in Europe. And both the rollout by the Secretary, who'd just come from a meeting of the Quad and was headed out to Hawaii for a trilateral with the ROK in Japan, was a clear sign that despite everything that was about to unfold, the United States did not intend to take its eye off the ball in the Indo-Pacific, and quite the opposite. It intended to double down on its commitment there and tell the region and the world what exactly we intended to do, despite the fact that we knew tragedy was about to unfold in Europe in all likelihood. I hope just to sort of underscore the fact of the powerful signal that the Secretary and the President decided to send in rolling out the strategy at that time. In telling you kind of what you need to know about the Indo-Pacific strategy, I'll hold up for you 5 key highlights. The first, as Senator Hagerty just touched upon, as Michèle just touched upon, is the fact that, number one, the United States is an Indo-Pacific power. The Indo-Pacific stretches to our west coast. The region encompasses half of the world's population, 2/3 of the world's economy, and in the coming decades will account for 2/3 of all global growth. So exactly as Michèle just said, our security and prosperity will increasingly be tied to the Indo-Pacific with every passing year. This is not just an assertion of the Biden administration. This is, as you have have seen a set of principles that is held on a bipartisan basis and has been across multiple presidential administrations. The United States will be an Indo-Pacific power for a very long time to come. The second thing you should know about the Indo-Pacific strategy is that it's an affirmative strategy. It sets out a list of key objectives for what we seek to achieve in the region, working with others. It certainly grapples with and takes deeply seriously the competition with China and China's increasingly assertive, sometimes very aggressive role in the region, as Michèle has very rightly laid out for us. But the Indo-Pacific strategy is not reducible to China. Indeed, the Indo-Pacific strategy is not the United States-China strategy. Rather, it is a strategy that seeks to achieve positive objectives working alongside others. It's really about what we're for, not who or what we stand against. Number 3 is the fact that this strategy is not just about U.S. leadership alone. This is the first U.S. government strategy that I'm aware of that explicitly aims to situate its own objectives and its own lines of effort alongside those of key regional allies and partners, as well as allies and partners outside of the region, giving a clear sense of where our strategies align and how we can deepen our work together. And that was very purposeful, to use the strategy as a jumping off point to accelerate cooperation with the allies and partners we will need to achieve the objectives that are laid out in the document itself. Fourth, I'd point to a key watchword which appears in several different places in the document, and that is the idea of building collective capacity in the region. A fundamental premise of this strategy that is laced through each one of its substantive pillars is the idea that by building new partnerships, making new flexible groupings of allies and partners, and reinforcing regional organizations, we can achieve these common objectives that are not achievable for us alone, and if we do not work with others. So whether we're talking about keeping the region free and open, whether we're talking about making it more prosperous, or combating transnational threats like climate change and global health crises of the future, we're setting out ways that we can actually marshal the power of allies and partners to achieve those goals together, not just simply underscoring the need to do so. Fifth, and finally, this strategy is extraordinarily ambitious. We land on a set of strategic objectives that are nothing less than, number 1, keeping the region free and open, number 2, a region that grows more connected, 3, an Indo-Pacific that is prosperous, 4, an Indo-Pacific that is secure, and 5, an Indo-Pacific that is resilient. And while these may sound like extremely lofty goals, we do believe they are achievable. Now, as I started my comments by noting, we recognize full well that the region is looking to us not just to issue a strategic document that says a lot of nice things, but really to see the rubber hit the road and see what is laid out in the Indo-Pacific strategy come to pass as soon as possible, accompanied by the resources that will be necessary to make this strategy real. And we're already well underway with that work. We have no illusions that this will be easy, particularly, as Michèle noted, in a year where there is a land war raging in Europe. But again, as I've alluded to, we do believe that genuinely these objectives are shared and therefore that this strategy is achievable.
Thanks for laying out the whole broad sweep. It really is a sort of interesting document, and I certainly, and I suspect a lot of other people in this room have paid a lot of attention to it. We'll come back to a bit more, particularly on the economic dimensions of the strategy. But let me turn to Michael Fullilove. Michael is Executive Director of the Lowy Institute, of which I'm privileged also to be a non-resident fellow. He previously advised Australian prime ministers as an author, including of a book on Franklin Roosevelt, and I understand is working on another one. And we're extremely fortunate to have picked him up on, I think, his first journey out of Australia since the pandemic. And as I mentioned, Michael is also have set up an institution from scratch, in this case, Lowy. Michael, thanks again for joining us. And if I may ask, from a non-American perspective, from somebody in the Indo-Pacific in Australia, how do you see the Biden administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific? And particularly, something that surprised a lot of people, made a lot of news, was the AUKUS agreement, which involves the United States, UK, and Australia. So tell us a little bit about how you see it from your vantage point.
Thank you, Dhruva. Yeah, it's great to be out of Fortress Australia after 2.5 years. Let me start by saying Mazel Tov to Dhruva and Sharon and Samir Saran and everybody at ORF who I really admire. And as Michèle and I know, it's fun running think tanks, so I think you guys are going to have a lot of fun. Secondly, let me say I'm honoured to be on this panel with the Senator and also with Mira, who's one of America's most brilliant young Asia officials, and of course Michèle, who's a national security leader I've admired for a long time, and as an Americophile I would say is one of the hopes of the side. So thank you very much, Dhruva, for having me on such a superstar panel. I think, look, Australia is very well disposed, I would say, to President Biden's policy. Now remember, let me take you back and remind you of some recent history. And I'm not just going to do this just because the Senator's left, but in the first week of President Trump's administration, he withdrew the United States from the TPP. He had a warm 1-hour phone call with President Putin, and he had a hostile and charged phone call with the Prime Minister of Australia. Under President Biden, it's been a completely different vibe. One of his earliest moves, of course, was to hold that virtual leaders meeting of the Quad leaders, followed up by in-person leaders meetings and so on. So first of all, I would say the vibe from day one was different. Secondly, I think we felt very comforted by the Allies First approach that the President has taken. It often seems to me that some presidents look at Asia and they see China first, whether in a good way or a bad way, but China is the thing that the organising principle. Other presidents, and I would say George W. Bush was one of these, and I think President Biden is one of these, looks at the region and first sees the Allies and first tries to make sure that allies are comfortable and feeling secure, and only then deals with China. And that's certainly what President Biden's team did in the chronology, if you remember, of the early phone calls and meetings. It was sort of an allies before Anchorage policy, if you like. So I think there's still a piece of work to be done, a settling point, I guess, to find in US policy towards China itself, and we look forward to hearing more about that. But I think from an allied point of view, I think it's very comforting. In terms of AUKUS, I think this is one of the most interesting developments in international relations in President Biden's administration. At the time of the fall of Kabul, you will recall, the newspapers were full of European analysts in particular saying, this is the end of Allies' faith in America and the end of America's commitment to its allies. And I always thought at the time that is way overdone, and said that publicly. And then only a couple of months later, we had this head-snapping development, which was the perfect rebuttal of both of those arguments. Because here you had the United States making a big bet on an old ally. It doesn't get much more intimate between two countries in terms of sharing the crown jewels of military technology in terms of nuclear propulsion. And on the other side, you had Australia doubling down on the alliance and saying, even while we thicken our connections with our Asian neighbours, we see the links to the United States and also to the United Kingdom as another old friend being very important. So I think that was hugely important. I think from Australia's perspective, AUKUS is a sign of ambition. It's a sign that the scales have fallen from our eyes, and we know the region in which we live, and we understand that we need capabilities that give us deterrent power. It's an indication that we need to try to help shape the regional balance of power. We can't be defensive. We have to have things that we can offer to the region too. And the final thing I'll say, Dhruva, is that AUKUS struck me in another way as a sort of a symbol of something we've seen sort of go exponential during Ukraine, and that is the quickening of the link, the quickening of the connections between like-minded countries. And we've seen that with Ukraine, with countries starting to pay proper attention to their defence, potentially the enlargement of NATO, but also much stronger connections between like-minded countries. And it reminded me, as an historian, I'm always looking for these links, it reminded me of something that Winston Churchill said in 1940, when the UK and the United States, before American entry into the Second World War, did the destroyer bases deal, whereby the United States handed the UK 50 overaged destroyers in return for access to British naval bases. And at the time, Churchill said, that he thought that Britain and the United States would have to get, and I love this quote, somewhat mixed up together in each other's affairs for mutual and general advantage. And I think in this century, with the challenges we face, you're going to see that more and more. Like-minded countries getting somewhat mixed up together in each other's affairs and working together more closely, whether it's on developing a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines or AI or quantum quantum computing or other sorts of issues, or getting mixed up with supplying arms to someone who's under threat. I think we're going to see like-minded countries getting more mixed up together. So to me, even beyond as an Australian, the signal it sent from the United States and the signal that we were sending, it was just a little waypost in that process of the quickening of connections between like-mindeds.
Wonderful. I think I'm just going to ask each of you one more question, and I'd really like to get the audience involved. Mira, one of the questions that a lot of people have been asking, including other capitals in the Indo-Pacific, has involved the economic dimension of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I know it's been rumored for some time that there'll be an Indo-Pacific economic framework that's announced. The president himself seems very seized with that idea. To the extent that's possible, could you elaborate a little bit about what the thinking is behind the Indo-Pacific economic framework?
Absolutely. You know, with the caveat that, of course, the framework is still under development. So I'm happy to share what I'm able. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is really a sort of new approach to economic partnership with the Indo-Pacific. Broadly construed, it will have 4 different pillars. The first will be organized around connecting our economies. That is, this pillar will relate to everything having to do with trade and the digital economy, to include the types of opportunities that Senator Hagerty mentioned in the digital economy when it comes to allies and partners in Asia. Second, there will be a set of approaches related to securing our economies and making them more resilient. And there, we're envisioning a set of agreements related to supply chains, supply chain resilience, and supply chain security. Third, a pillar that is focused on clean, green economies, and that's where we'll organize our efforts on climate, energy, and infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific. And fourth and finally, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework will seek to advance fair economies. And this is the portion of the framework that will focus on tax and anti-corruption issues. Now, as you've mentioned, Dhruva, the framework is still under development, but we will be able to say more about it, including say more about its partnership in the coming weeks. For now, we have been very grateful for productive conversations with allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific who have been working closely with us to make sure that this agreement is a success.
Well, thank you. A little sneak peek at something to come. Michèle, if I may ask about one thing we haven't discussed yet. I mean, there's so many aspects of the Indo-Pacific. The Indian Ocean is heating up. North Korea is, promised to increase its nuclear arsenal. The South China Sea remains a contested point. The Solomon Islands is now in the news. But what about Taiwan, if I may ask? And it's a place I know you've also been engaged with quite a bit. How do you see Taiwan sort of remaining a flashpoint in the future?
Well, I think Taiwan, unfortunately, is kind of the flashpoint from the perspective of a potential future Chinese use of force. I don't think, like I said, I think this is the reunification of Taiwan is a clearly articulated, repeatedly articulated objective for President Xi during his tenure. But I think for those of you who are Star Trek fans, you remember the Borg, assimilation into the Borg. The preferred approach is economic political coercion to sort of engulf, encircle, and absorb Taiwan, sort of giving them, no other option. Some of the Chinese messaging on Taiwanese social media after the invasion of Ukraine was, resistance is futile. Today Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan, which I don't believe is true. But the point is, the preferred approach is certainly using other means of coercion. But I think he's also been very clear that military means are not off the table. And so I think, I had the opportunity to participate in a delegation that was sent by President Biden to Taiwan to try to reassure President Tsai and the people of Taiwan that the U.S. remains very committed to Taiwan as a democracy, we have shared interests, values, a huge trading relationship, all kinds of shared interests. And what was interesting to me is that President Tsai used our visit to really talk to her own people. And her messages were pretty clear. It was, number one, look what happens when you stand up and fight for your democracy and your freedom. When you resist aggression, unprovoked aggression, the international community responds with all kinds of economic support, military equipment, unbelievable economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, all of that, to say, look, we have to be prepared to fight for, our own society and our own freedom and democracy. Number two, we've got to be better prepared. We've got to invest in more asymmetric capabilities to bolster our ability to help defend ourselves. We have to reform our military reserves. We have to create a civilian mobilization agency that would sort of organize society in the event of some kind of, whether it's a natural disaster or an invasion, that we can muster the people, organize ourselves, and support, resilience and resistance. So I think the Taiwanese are having an internal discussion that's very, very important, and they're watching Ukraine for lessons very, very closely, even as President Xi is certainly watching to see how ultimately this turns out for Vladimir Putin. But I think for our part, the United States, and frankly, I think for our allies and partners, we need to do more to help Taiwan build its own defense capabilities, to help train them in the kind and help them become more of a porcupine, if you will, and less, more indigestible to the, I guess, where am I going with this animal metaphor, to the Chinese dragon? I don't know if Chinese dragons eat porcupines, but, to really invest in their own defense and make it more effective. But also to support them in the international space. And again, as I said at the beginning, to really be very clear with China that we are willing to, defend the rules-based order, which means that, larger states don't get to unilaterally change the status of smaller entities just because they're more powerful through the use of force. We don't want we live in a world where that becomes the norm, right? So I think Taiwan is going to be very important, not immediate. I don't fear an immediate move from what I know outside government, but I do worry about in the near to midterm very much.
Sure. Michael, in Australia, you have an election coming up pretty soon, next month. It seems to be very closely contested, and at times in the past, foreign policy has been a pretty divisive issue between the two major parties of the coalition. And how do you see the relationship with the United States, the broader Indo-Pacific issues? How is that playing out in the elections? I mean, without getting into asking you to predict the outcome, how do you see that becoming an election issue?
Well, first of all, Michèle, if you want to diversify your animal metaphors
Yes.
even further, you can use the echidna, which is like an Australian porcupine.
Okay, there we go.
If you want an Australian element to the indigestible, spiky defence strategy, I'm going to offer that to you as a gift.
Thank you.
Yes, we've got an election on the 21st of May, which is very tight indeed, and we hosted at the Institute, we hosted the Prime Minister, Mr Morrison, and the opposition leader, Mr Albanese, a couple of weeks ago. In this past week, the big issue in the Australian election has been China. And China is actually the biggest story probably in Australia over the last 3 years, as our relationship has gone into a downward spiral. And why has it done that? Why has our relationship changed? Well, principally because China has changed, I would say, as an Australian. But we are in a downward spiral where each sees the other person's actions as a provocation, whereas we see our own actions as simply reactions to the other sides' actions. But we're in a position at the moment now, a situation at the moment, we're in a diplomatic deep freeze from China, and where China has also imposed sanctions on many of our exports. Unfortunately for China, the resource prices have meant that the economic effect, the macroeconomic effect on Australia has been minimal. But nevertheless, it's not normal for a country to be at daggers drawn with its largest trading partner. And so this is the biggest story in Australia, and it's the biggest story in the past week in the Australian election because of the security pact that Solomon Islands has signed with China. I would say that the parties are largely bipartisan on the issue of China and on foreign policy more generally. I would say that the similarities outweigh the differences. Partly that's because both sides of politics have seen how China has changed, and the avenues for solving some of the intractable problems with China have narrowed. And of course, the Solomons development in the past week won't help that at all. The other reason that there's bipartisanship is that public opinion in Australia has hardened very significantly. So in the Lowy Institute poll in 2018, 52% of Australians said they trusted China to do the right thing in the world. In the 2021 poll, which came out midway through last year, 16%. So one third, a very substantial decline in 3 years. So there are differences between Labor and the coalition, and we can talk about those. But I think in general, there is not a lot of prospect for improving the China relationship in the short term. And the interesting thing that's happened in the past week is that China has turned from a positive for the government to a negative. I think when Mr. Morrison spoke to the Lowy Institute a couple of weeks ago, he was very confident in his foreign policy stance. He's very proud of AUKUS. I think he felt that position would earn him credit from the Australian people, and perhaps it will. But just at the moment, at this week, it's the opposite, because the debate in Australia is how is it that in relation to a country like Solomon Islands, with which we've probably had the most intense engagement of any Pacific island country over the past 20 years, how is it that even with Solomon Islands we couldn't persuade them that a deal that is plainly on its face bad for Solomon Islands was in fact not in their interests? And if we don't have influence in Solomon Islands, then how can we be persuasive throughout the rest of the region? So I'd say it's broadly bipartisan, but it's playing out in unexpected ways.
Thank you. I think we have about 15 minutes for some questions from the audience. So if you could please raise your hands, I'll call on a few people to raise hands. And if you could please introduce yourselves and then direct your questions. So I think we have a question up here. If I can get my colleague, will just bring a mic. Yep.
Well, thank you. Brent Sadler from the Heritage Foundation, Senior Research Fellow for Naval Warfare and Advanced Technologies. My question is actually for pretty much all your perspectives on the panel, but really focusing on yours, Mira, and that is, in the next 6 months or to the end of the year, what are some of the, I guess, tangible objectives or things that you'll see that'll indicate that the strategy is working? And the same question also from Canberra. You know, the strategy and the policies that are in place right now in Australia, what would be those tangible actions or events that would indicate that Australia is on the right course?
Kim, over here.
Hi, Kim Dozier, visiting fellow at Orf America. I wanted to ask about the impact of the Ukraine conflict on the Indo-Pacific strategy. If you're concerned, especially Dr. Rapp-Hooper, if you're concerned that the majority of the world's population voted either with Russia or abstained at some of the key UN votes, as members of some of those votes have pointed out to me. And also, what if China does move sooner rather than later? In terms of our main tool to try to discipline Russia has been sanctions. What if Europe had to turn around and try to sanction China as well as Russia right now? Isn't that economic disaster? So,
take one more question, then maybe I think all the questions directed at Mira, but anyone else? There. I think, all the way in the back. Yeah. Oh.
Hi, thank you, Jake and Sarah. How do we build another pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy around citizen engagement, and how do we actually get our peoples outside of capital cities excited about this new partnership? Because it can't just be a conversation at think tanks and in capital cities. It has to be something that citizens are quite interested to engage with in order to make sure it has sustainability.
Great. Mira, if I could turn to you, I mean, a few things. How would you gauge the success? What are your views on Ukraine, if you want to answer that, and the prospect of China moving as well?
Sure, absolutely. So I will go to Kim's question first, and then I'll turn back to the Indo-Pacific strategy. So on the question of the Ukraine conflict, there's no question that when there is a war raging in Europe, it is more difficult to move ahead with strategy elsewhere in the world. But that in no way sort of diminishes our will or our intent to roll out in full force with the strategy that we've put on paper. The place where that will be the most challenging, as anyone would tell you, is in making sure that we can fully resource what we have told the region we will do. And frankly, that's a challenge for any administration. We are now the third successive administration from both political parties that has promised to do a far lot more in the Indo-Pacific, and the challenge has always been resources. But our noses are already to the grindstone on that, working both with OMB and with Congress, and I do think we're going to make significant headway there despite the tragedy that is unfolding in Europe. When it comes to the sanctions question that you asked, I think the most important thing is to ensure that both Russia and China learn the right lessons from Ukraine. That means not just devastating sanctions right now, but a sanctions coalition that holds together, a political coalition that holds together, and support for Ukraine that does not diminish even as time passes. And that is the best way to avert the cataclysm that you were alluding to here. Beyond voting at the UN, which is of course very important, and I would note that many of our closest Indo-Pacific allies and partners did vote with us at the UN, I also think it's important that we count the different forms of support that Indo-Pacific allies and partners have brought to the table. Whether it's Australia, Japan, the ROK, or Singapore, we have seen unprecedented levels of sanctions from close allies and partners, stringent export controls that have helped to make some of the biggest difference in the export control regimes, and even creative liquefied natural gas swaps that help Europe to get LNG despite the crisis that was unfolding. So while it is, of course, always possible to point to votes that we wish went somewhat differently, it's also really important to grapple with the fact that, as Michael rightly noted, we are seeing an unprecedented level of cooperation and unity between these two regions. And if we can keep that up, I think we will have sent just the right signals indeed. To this question about how we should be kind of monitoring the Indo-Pacific strategy's implementation, it's a great one, and we've actually given you the tools to do that in the strategy itself. If you turn to the back of the strategy, you'll see that there's a list of about 10 items that we title our Indo-Pacific Action Plan, and those are things that we intend to implement in the region within 12 to 24 months of the strategy's release. So it's not quite the 6-month time frame that you laid out, but I think that we can sort of calibrate a number of those to your question. So just as a few examples, we would increase our strengthen our relationship with ASEAN, including by hosting an ASEAN special summit and coming up with new initiatives, investing in new aspects of the relationship with ASEAN. We will increase our commitment to and resources for the Pacific Islands. Explicitly, as Michael has mentioned, we're keenly aware of the fact that the Pacific Islands are under-resourced, and we want to work with other like-minded partners to make headway in providing resources related to climate resilience, maritime security and infrastructure, and time cannot waste to do that. You'll also want to look for us making major progress on AUKUS, specifically detailing our chosen pathway for how to deliver a nuclear-powered sub to Australia along a reasonable timeline, and a number of other initiatives that we detail on that list, to include the successful launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Finally, to our colleague's question in the back related to people-to-people ties, we couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more that this is a really important part of regional strategy. We can't just be geostrategists in armchairs thinking about how we want to work together to shape the region over the long term. We have to ensure that our people actually feel that that's in their interest and that that's part of their lives. One of the things that we are trying to reinvest in as part of this strategy and as part of our broader approach are educational exchanges, language programs, and in particular a new fellowship that we have just launched through the Quad, which you'll be hearing more about in the coming weeks. The Quad Fellowship will bring 100 students from all 4 of our Quad countries, that is the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, to the United States every year for graduate degrees in STEM fields. And the idea is to build a cohort of science and technology leading edge experts who not only are kind of at the top of the pack, but are committed to research collaboration together from their home countries going forward. So of course, these are just a few programs, but they are very much aimed at exactly what you're indicating, the fact that this is not just about governments, it's also about people.
Michael, could you address how would you see success? How would you assess success of the strategy? And also maybe, I'd love to hear Michèle about this after a little later, but sort of, again, running a think tank, you also do public opinion surveys. How do you get the message, when it's one thing for people in Canberra to have an idea, but how do you get the message out to people outside of that? And is the Indo-Pacific, in fact, a good example of that in the Australian case?
In terms of the success of the US strategy, if that's what you're asking me, I think first of all the economic element is really critical, because the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index, for example, every year shows what we all know, that the US still has tremendous power projection capability and the ability to reach into any part of the globe and exert influence, but the economic element in our part of the region is the missing piece. So seeing the United States compete more effectively with the magnetic power of the Chinese economy is really as important as all the other elements combined. I think the second element is just keeping the United States focused on the region, and I know this is something that I'm sure is a challenge for Mira and has been a challenge for Michèle as well. As a global power, you're always being called upon to do things all around the world, and many of those things are absolutely important things, like supporting Ukraine in its defence, which is a world historic event. But I think it's sort of coming back, and if the things that Michèle said in her remarks are true about the Indo-Pacific being the principal place where history will be made and where America's fortunes will be made, then you need to maintain your focus on that. One of the things that always disappointed me about President Obama's pivot, for example, was that he never spoke much about the pivot in the United States. He spoke a lot about it overseas. In fact, I attended his Canberra speech, which was a fantastic speech, but I don't think he ever made a single major foreign policy speech in the United States that was devoted to the pivot. And yet, how does that make sense if you really believe that this is a geostrategic shift, a policy shift for the ages, one that should transcend administrations? Then you need to be explaining that to the American people. The final point I'd make is just on how Australia would see or what Australia should be doing next, to take the gentleman's question. I mean, you could think about that in lots of different ways, but maybe just to focus in on Solomons and the Pacific. I think we need to, Australia and the United States, we need to sort of pick ourselves up now and dust ourselves off and say and acknowledge that the security agreement is unfortunate and it's a setback for our interests. But see what we do next. And we can't prevent that agreement, but maybe we can put a ceiling on it. And we need to double down in our relations with Pacific Island states, and we need to have positive things to offer them, so that they continue to see us as the partners that they choose to work with, not a country like China. So, for me, that's the important thing: is doubling down and deepening and diversifying our relations in the Southwest Pacific to so that, because otherwise we're on the defense the whole time, playing whack-a-mole where there's another story about China's influence here or there, and we need to get out in front of this, I think, and really, as Mira said, I'm delighted to hear her talk about extra resources, and perhaps one silver lining of the security agreement will be more attention from Congress, for example, and more resources that the United States can spend. But we, in Australia, we have to take a hard look at ourselves too. And, as I said, for a country that is as intimately connected with Australia, we need to ask ourselves why our arguments were not persuasive. That's on us.
Let me just briefly ask on the question of getting some of the challenges you laid out in your opening remarks, getting that out to an audience outside of DC. How much of a challenge is that, or how much of a challenge do you anticipate that being?
I do think it is a challenge, but I think it's incumbent upon certainly every president to use the bully pulpit to try to educate the American people about why this matters. Why is it a priority? Why should they care? How does it affect them? The so-called kitchen table issues. How does it affect their economic situation, their security, our national security, and so forth? And I think that is something that I would love to hear, the president do even more than he has. I think he's done more than most of his predecessors, but I'd love to hear him do more. I think in the think tank community, we have a huge opportunity to get the message out, whether it's working with media. Yesterday, I spent the whole day at the NBC studios. CNAS and the Meet the Press have cooperated to film a Taiwan war game. And so that will be broadcast, that will be kind of boiled down to an hour. It's really trying to explain the situation to the American people, walk people through the pros, the cons, the risks, and why they should care. But also, I'm always encouraging people to get out of Washington, go speak at university campuses, go visit, chambers of commerce. We have World Trade Centers in states across the country. I mean, just take those opportunities to get out and engage broader audiences and talk about these issues. And I'm surprised that when you do get out there, there's a lot of interest and a lot of resonance, and there's a lot of desire to understand more deeply, what's going on, what's going to happen, what we should be doing and thinking about. So.
Great. We have time for a couple more questions. So if anybody, I think Ash, Jane, and I think you had your hand up earlier, but let's start maybe in the back with.
Yes, hi. Ash Jane with the Atlantic Council. Well, thanks for your presentations. My question is for Mira. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that you laid out has some very ambitious goals. It sounds very compelling. Question I have is there a role beyond just the trans-Pacific powers that we're engaging, particularly Europe, just coming out of meetings where our transatlantic partners, Germany and the British and others, are dealing with the same questions about supply chain vulnerabilities and the kinds of things you're talking about. So is there any thinking about how European allies could connect into that kind of framework that you're laying out?
Thank you. And one right in the front here. If you just wait 1 second for the microphone. Here.
Michael Fleischman, question for Michael. What lessons can other countries take from managing a decline in the relationship with China? You alluded to Australia's economic resiliency, and obviously a lot of that has to do with its resource-based economy. But what lessons can other countries take, and in what respects can that course be replicable for other nations that are not comfortable with their relationship with China?
You want to take that? I think it's one directed to you and.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ash, for your question. I'll say that in the first instance, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is envisioned as an Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but it is also envisioned to be quite flexible, and there is the ability for it to, potentially grow and change with time. So I think its early stages will be focused on the region, but that's not dispositive of evolution in the future. That said, the administration, particularly on issues like supply chains or critical and emerging technologies, where there is a huge amount of interest, where there is, as Michèle noted, the sort of critical need for us to be working closely with allies and partners, and where we have a tremendous amount of collective capacity to affect things if we work not only within one region but across regions. The administration has taken something of a modular approach to these issues. So that is to say, making sure that agreements or objectives that we're pursuing, for example, through the Trade and Technology Council with our European partners, are also consonant and reconcilable with what we're doing in the Quad when we work on supply chains. So this is all to say that these agendas are all kind of moving together, even if and as there are cases where we are working in specific regional groupings that might not yet overlap.
And on a side, I don't know if you saw, but yesterday the EU and India announced a Trade and Technology Council model on the US-Europe one, so it's an interesting development. Michael, do you want to take the question on Australia's lessons learned?
Yeah, well, one lesson is it's very useful to have extensive deposits of iron ore when iron prices are going through the roof. That's a lesson that everyone can take. I think that, look, I would be a bit reluctant. I don't want to appear boastful. I think Australia takes the view that you have to stand up for yourself, and you can't just buckle. And when people try to coerce you and try to push you, you can't go along with it. Australians are stubborn individuals in that way, because if you do, then that's the new starting point, and then they'll ask for more. So I think all of us have to do that. We have to stand up for ourselves, for our own interests, and for our ideals. I wouldn't say that the Australian policy towards China has been perfect. I think in diplomacy you need guile as well as strength, and sometimes I think ministers and especially MPs have been a bit artless in their public comments on China, especially as public opinion changes in the way that I've indicated, and it's a very popular thing to do. And I think some of them could have been a bit smarter about focusing on things that really matter, focusing on our core sovereignty questions, and not sort of taking unnecessary slaps. I don't think that helps anybody, because the truth is we need a relationship with China. They're always there. They're going to be there right near us forever. They're not going anywhere, and we're not going anywhere. And we want to be able to trade with them. As Michèle said, we want to be able to cooperate with them on climate, for example, because there's no answer to the climate change challenge without China. So it's not healthy, and that's why I say it's not a sort of a point of pride that I'm delighted by that no Australian minister has spoken to a Chinese counterpart for a long time. That's not good. The principal reason for that is not Australia's fault. The main actors in this case, I think, are the men in Zhongnanhai, not the men and women in Canberra. But I think we need to keep that in mind. So I hope that when we get past the election, maybe next year, we can start to find, are there areas where we can start to talk to the Chinese again? I think that would be useful, but we have to do that from a position of strength. And if you do that from a position of weakness, you're finished.
Well, thank you. We've had a very stimulating hour-long discussion. Thank you all for your time. Please join me in thanking the panelists for what was a great opening panel. And we will have a 15-minute break after this, and I hope you'll rejoin us for what is an equally compelling panel on energy partnerships that'll start in 15 minutes. But thank you once again, all of you, for taking time.